What if the man you walk past on the street, the one with torn clothes and tired eyes, wasn't just a beggar at all, but a brilliant mind waiting for a second chance? Before we begin this story, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments below. I'd love to know how far this story travels, and who's listening on the other side of the screen. What would you do if you saw a beggar sitting outside your office? Most people would glance for a moment, maybe drop a few coins, and rush on with their day. But one man, a CEO, made a choice that would change everything. Not just for the beggar, but for himself, his company, and, in many ways, for everyone who would later hear the story. It was a sharp morning in the middle of downtown. The streets buzzed with the sound of cars, briefcases tapping against polished shoes, voices hurrying to meetings that couldn't wait. And there, right at the entrance of Hayes Industries, sat a man who seemed invisible to the world rushing past him. His clothes were worn, frayed at the edges. His hair was unkempt, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he held a cardboard sign. It carried only 2 words: need work, not need money. Not hungry, please help, just need work. That was when Daniel Hayes stopped in his tracks. Daniel, a man in his mid-40s, the CEO of one of the fastest growing engineering firms in the country. Sharp suit, polished shoes, a man who had built his empire on discipline, resilience, and an unshakable belief that no person was beyond redemption, if only given the right chance. Looking down at the stranger with weary eyes, Daniel didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he leaned forward and asked softly, "How about a job for today instead of spare change?" The man's head lifted slowly. His eyes, though tired, still carried a spark, something hidden beneath the dirt and despair. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air, and then the man nodded. This was no ordinary encounter. This wasn't just a CEO testing a beggar. This was the beginning of a story about dignity, hidden brilliance, and the kind of second chance most people only dream of. Because what Daniel didn't know yet was that this man, this homeless stranger, had once been an engineer, a brilliant one, but he had lost everything. And now, fate had brought them face to face. Before the story unfolds, one question lingers. If you had been in Daniel's shoes, standing outside that office tower, what would you have done? Would you have given money and walked away? Or would you have taken the risk of giving a stranger a chance? This is the story of Daniel Hayes, the CEO who offered a beggar a job and uncovered hidden truth that would change both of their lives forever. Daniel Hayes wasn't a man who believed in luck. He believed in choices. Every brick of his company, every deal, every late night spent staring at plans and prototypes. It all came from decisions he made when the odds were stacked against him. People saw the sharp suit, the corner office, the polished shoes. They rarely saw the nights he slept on a couch in his first office, or the mornings he pitched to investors who laughed him out of the room. That was why he didn't believe in tossing coins into a paper cup. To him, money without purpose was like pouring water into a bucket full of holes. It vanished quickly, but a chance, an opportunity, that could change a person's entire direction. His employees knew this about him. Some admired it, some found it strange. His assistant, Claire Bennett, had worked with him for almost a decade, and she'd often joked that Daniel saw the world in puzzles. Where others saw broken pieces, he saw the potential for something whole. So when he looked at the man on the sidewalk, Daniel's mind didn't immediately leap to pity. It leapt to possibility. He remembered his own struggles, how at one point he'd been a paycheck away from losing everything. He remembered the moment when one mentor, one person, gave him a shot that nobody else would. That single decision had changed the course of his entire life. Daniel had carried that lesson with him into every boardroom, every deal, and every hiring decision. To him, resumes were important, yes, but they weren't the whole picture. What mattered more was resilience. How a person handled being underestimated. How they stood up after being knocked down. And yet, not everyone in his company agreed with this philosophy. The board of directors liked safe bets, polished candidates with Ivy League degrees and spotless records. Risk wasn't something they tolerated easily. Daniel had fought them on this more than once, reminding them that genius doesn't always wear a tailored suit. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, behind rough edges and unconventional paths. This belief wasn't born out of naivety. It came from experience. Daniel had watched people with perfect credentials crumble under pressure, while others, those who carried invisible scars, rose higher than anyone expected. He had learned that pain could sharpen a person, carve them into someone stronger. So when he saw the cardboard sign that morning, his instincts kicked in. Need work, not need money. That difference mattered. It told Daniel that the man sitting there wasn't asking to be rescued. He was asking for a chance to prove himself, to be useful, to earn. And Daniel respected that deeply. It was why he bent down instead of walking past. Why he offered a job instead of coins. Because he believed that dignity comes not from what is given freely, but from what is earned. For Daniel Hayes, this wasn't just charity. It was alignment with everything he stood for. What he couldn't know, as he straightened up and gestured for the man to follow him inside, was just how right his instincts would prove to be. Inside the polished glass walls of Hayes Industries, the contrast could not have been sharper. Suits moved with purpose. Shoes clicked against marble floors. Voices traded technical jargon at a pace that could leave an outsider dizzy. And in the middle of it all walked Michael Carter, his shoulders hunched, his steps uncertain, every eye in the lobby trailing him like he didn't belong. Claire Bennett, always efficient, handed him a stack of papers. Her polite smile didn't quite hide the doubt in her eyes. A few employees whispered as they passed, their words sharp enough to sting even if he couldn't make out every syllable. "What's Daniel thinking?" one of them muttered. "Bringing a man like that in here." Michael kept his head low. He wasn't here to argue with their judgment. He was here because, for the first time in years, someone had given him a door to walk through instead of one slamming shut in his face. The day moved on, and Daniel, true to his word, gave Michael small tasks. Sorting notes, carrying folders, helping Claire with schedules. Menial work, but work nonetheless. Michael did it carefully, silently, with a kind of determination that surprised even Claire. Yet it wasn't enough to quiet the whispers. By the afternoon, Daniel's senior engineering team gathered in the conference room. White boards stretched across the walls, covered in scribbles of half-erased equations and complex diagrams. At the center of it all stood James Porter, head of engineering, his voice clipped with frustration. "We've been stuck on this for 2 weeks," James said, marker tapping against the board. "Every adjustment throws off the balance. Every recalculation takes us back to square one. If we can't crack this, the entire project falls behind schedule." The room grew tense. Engineers shifted in their chairs, murmuring about deadlines and budgets. Daniel leaned back, arms crossed, his eyes sharp as ever. He thrived on watching his team wrestle with problems. But even he could see the fatigue settling in. In the corner, almost invisible, Michael sat quietly, clutching the edge of his chair. He wasn't supposed to be there, just a bystander, an errand boy for the day. But his eyes, tired though they were, locked onto the whiteboard. The numbers, the equations, the errors that leapt out at him like flashing lights in the dark. He hesitated, his chest tightening. His hands shook. For years he had buried this part of himself, convinced it no longer mattered. But now, staring at that problem, something inside him stirred, an old instinct, a muscle memory he thought he had lost. The voices in the room blurred together until finally, almost against his will, Michael whispered, "You're carrying the wrong variable forward." The chatter stopped. Heads turned. James narrowed his eyes. "What did you say?" Michael's throat went dry. He hadn't meant to speak so loud. His voice cracked as he repeated, "The variable. Here," he pointed weakly toward the board. "It doesn't belong in that stage of the equation. That's why it keeps breaking." A silence fell over the room, thick and heavy. James scoffed, dismissive. "This isn't something you pick up on the street. We've been over this a dozen times." Daniel's gaze, however, didn't leave Michael. "Show us," he said quietly. Michael froze. His body tensed as every insecurity screamed at him to stay seated, to keep quiet, to avoid the humiliation waiting for him if he was wrong. But then Daniel's words replayed in his mind. How about a job for today instead of spare change? He hadn't been given a chance like this in years. Slowly, he stood. His hands shook as he took the marker from James. For a moment, he just stared at the whiteboard, the lines and numbers blurring before his eyes. He forced a breath, then another, and then with careful strokes, he began to erase, adjust, rewrite. The room leaned in, murmurs fading into silence. Step by step, Michael reconstructed the problem. His voice steadied as he explained, "You're treating this load as a constant, but in reality, it shifts under stress. If you calculate it here," he circled one area, "and adjust the balance ratio here," he marked another. "The design holds." He dropped the marker, his heart pounding. For a beat, no one moved. Then James stepped forward, scanning the new equation, running the numbers in his head. His face shifted from irritation to disbelief. "He's right," James muttered. "He solved it." The room erupted in a mix of surprise and disbelief. Engineers leaned forward, whispering. Claire covered her mouth, eyes wide. And Daniel didn't smile, not yet, but his gaze on Michael was steady, almost proud. In that moment, the whispers about him, the ragged clothes, the skeptical glances, fell silent. For the first time in years, Michael Carter wasn't invisible. He wasn't a beggar sitting on the sidewalk. He was an engineer. And Daniel Hayes knew this was only the beginning. The conference room had emptied, but Daniel Hayes remained seated at the long, polished table, his thoughts circling the events of the afternoon. Michael Carter had walked into his company as a beggar, and within an hour, he had solved a problem that his best engineers had been struggling with for weeks. Daniel wasn't a man who believed in coincidences. He believed in reasons, in causes hidden beneath appearances. And he knew there was only one way to understand what he had just witnessed. So, he asked Michael to step into his office. The door closed behind them, muffling the distant hum of the building. Daniel poured 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of the man who still looked uncomfortable in his borrowed clothes, his posture stiff, his hands restless against the arm of the chair. For a while, the only sound was a quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You didn't just stumble onto that equation by chance. Who are you, Michael? Who were you before all of this?" Michael's eyes flickered toward the floor. His shoulders slumped, as though the weight of years pressed down on him all at once. For a moment, he said nothing. His throat worked silently, as if the words themselves were too heavy to form. Then, with a long, trembling breath, he began. "I used to be someone else. Someone I don't even recognize anymore." His voice cracked, but slowly the story spilled out. Michael Carter had once been a respected engineer. He spoke of the projects he had led, the teams that had admired him, the innovations that carried his name. There was pride in his tone at first, but it quickly crumbled as he reached the turning point. He had a family, a wife named Emily, a daughter named Grace. His face softened as he said their names, like he was seeing them again in his mind. Her gentle smile, the way his little girl's laughter filled their home. For a brief moment, the light in his eyes returned, and then it shattered. His voice grew quieter, rougher. One rainy evening years ago, Emily and Grace were driving home from visiting her parents. A truck ran a red light. The collision was brutal. They never made it back. Michael's words broke apart into pauses, his breath catching as though speaking their deaths was like reliving them. "I got the call while I was at work. I should have been with them. Maybe I could have done something." He rubbed his eyes with shaking hands, but the grief was raw, unhealed. "I thought I was strong," he continued, almost whispering. "But the truth is, I collapsed. I started drinking. I stopped showing up to work. The projects piled up. The deadlines passed. And eventually, the company that once trusted me had no choice but to let me go." The silence in the room thickened. Daniel didn't interrupt. He let the man speak. "My savings disappeared. Friends stopped calling. I told myself I'd pull it together. But every morning I woke up and wished I hadn't. And so, one thing led to another. The apartment went, then the car, and before I knew it, I was just another man on the street with nothing but a cardboard sign." His hands clenched into fists. His voice dropped low. "The worst part wasn't losing the house, or the money, or even the respect. The worst part was losing who I was. I wasn't Michael the engineer anymore. I was just the man people crossed the street to avoid. The confession hung heavy between them. The coffee on the desk had gone cold. Daniel leaned forward, studying the broken figure across from him. He saw more than a man who had fallen. He saw the scars of grief, the echo of brilliance buried under years of pain. And beneath all of it, he saw a spark. Fragile, yes, but alive. For Michael, speaking those words was like tearing open a wound he had spent years hiding beneath silence and shame. Yet, for the first time, he felt something shift. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just another beggar on the sidewalk. Someone had listened. Someone had looked past the dirt, the torn clothes, the failures, and had seen the man he used to be. And in that moment, Michael Carter realized, maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to become him again. The office lights glowed faintly against the falling evening. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving the halls of Hayes Industries unusually quiet. Daniel Hayes stood by the tall glass window of his office. The city stretched out before him in a sea of lights. His reflection stared back at him, composed on the outside, conflicted on the inside. The story he had just heard from Michael Carter refused to leave his mind. A man who had once been a brilliant engineer, reduced to sleeping on sidewalks because grief had consumed him. And then, today, against all odds, he had walked into Daniel's company and solved a problem his own team couldn't untangle. It should have been simple. Daniel could have thanked him, offered him a meal, maybe a hotel room for the night, and sent him on his way. That's what most people expected him to do. But Daniel wasn't most people. He ran his hand slowly across the back of his chair, his thoughts heavy. To bring Michael into the company wasn't just about one man's redemption. It was about risk. The board would fight him on it. He could already hear their voices in tomorrow's meeting. This is reckless, Daniel. He's unstable. He's a liability. James Porter, the head engineer, would surely object too. James valued order, control, predictability. He'd see Michael as nothing but chaos wrapped in worn-out clothes. And maybe on the surface, they were right. Michael had admitted to losing himself to alcohol, to letting grief destroy his life. He had no home, no clean record, no safety net. Bringing him into the company was like walking a tightrope without a harness. But then Daniel remembered the way Michael had stood in that conference room, Marker shaking his hand, every eye on him. He remembered the silence that followed as Michael rewrote the equation, not with arrogance, but with quiet precision. He remembered the look on his face when James admitted he was right, like, for the first time in years, Michael believed he was still worth something. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. He thought back to his own past, the nights he had doubted himself, the times when one small chance had made all the difference. A mentor who believed in him when no one else did. A single decision that had changed his entire future. He whispered into the quiet of his office, almost to himself, if no one had given me that chance, would I even be here now? The weight of the question pressed against him. Logic told him to let Michael go, to protect the company, to keep things clean, safe, professional. But something deeper, something in Daniel's gut, told him that this was bigger than business, that sometimes the true measure of leadership wasn't in balance sheets or quarterly profits, but in seeing potential where no one else dared to look. Daniel paced the room, tore between the practical and the human. He could picture the headlines if this went wrong. CEO hires homeless man, project collapses, millions lost. Yet at the same time, he imagined something else. Disgraced engineer rebuilt. Company saved by an unlikely second chance. Both outcomes felt possible. His hand pressed against the glass as he looked down at the city, the endless rush of strangers below. How many of them carried stories untold? How many lives had derailed simply because no one had reached out when it mattered most? Daniel exhaled, the decision crystallizing in his mind. It wasn't about appearances. It wasn't even about risk anymore. It was about dignity, about giving back to someone what had once been taken from him. When he finally turned from the window, his reflection looked different, clearer, resolved. Tomorrow, he would face the board. Tomorrow, he would face James. But tonight, Daniel Hayes had already chosen. Michael Carter would not walk back onto the street, not as a beggar. He would walk back in as an engineer with a second chance. The next morning, the world inside Hayes Industries moved like a machine. Phones ringing, keyboards clattering, conversations layered over one another. But for Michael Carter, walking through those glass doors felt like stepping into an entirely new life. His clothes were borrowed, his shoes worn thin, and yet he walked with a posture he hadn't carried in years. Half pride, half fear. Daniel Hayes had done what few men of his status would dare. He hadn't given Michael a handful of cash or a warm meal for the night. He had given him something infinitely harder and infinitely more valuable. A chance. Michael's first day wasn't wrapped in applause or smiles. In fact, most eyes that fell on him carried suspicion. The engineers glanced at him like an outsider invading their space. Some whispered quietly in the corner. Curiosity mixed with doubt. And James Porter, head of engineering, didn't bother to hide his scorn. His sharp eyes narrowed as Michael entered the lab, as though silently daring him to make one mistake. Daniel stood nearby, observing. He said nothing, letting Michael feel the weight of both expectation and judgment. Because Daniel knew, true redemption never came wrapped in comfort. It came through fire. The project Michael had been thrown into was not simple. A faulty algorithm threatening to derail a crucial contract. A design flaw buried so deeply that even seasoned engineers were stumped. Daniel had seen Michael untangle it once on that whiteboard, but this was different. This was the battlefield of real deadlines, real pressure. Michael's hands trembled slightly as he typed, the screen filling with lines of code. Every keystroke felt like a reminder of all he had lost. He hadn't touched a workstation in years. His mind was sharp, but his body betrayed the tremor of nerves, the fatigue of sleepless nights on cold concrete. And yet, slowly, something began to awaken. Muscle memory. The old instincts of a man who had once built solutions that others couldn't even see. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, drowning out the whispers around him. Hours passed. By evening, the tension in the room was thick. James Porter leaned against the wall, arms crossed, convinced Michael would collapse under pressure. But then it happened. Michael's fingers stilled on the keyboard. His shoulders lifted as if a weight had finally shifted. He turned the monitor toward the team. Lines of broken code, now rewoven into order. A solution staring them in the face. For a moment, silence. Then murmurs. Then a reluctant nod from one of the engineers. Even James, stone-faced, stepped forward, scanning the lines, and though his lips stayed tight, his eyes betrayed something he couldn't hide. Reluctant respect. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't clap. He simply watched. Because what mattered wasn't the problem solved. It was the man solving it. And yet, this was only the beginning. In the days that followed, Michael fought battles no one else could see. Not just technical challenges, but the demons that haunted him when the office lights dimmed. The memories of his wife's laughter. The crushing silence after she was gone. The bottle he used to drown it all. Some nights, he sat alone in his small temporary apartment, staring at the walls, tempted to fall back into old habits. But then, he'd remember that marker in his hand, that whiteboard, that second chance. Slowly, routine stitched itself into his life again. Morning coffee instead of whiskey, early meetings instead of sleepless streets, purpose instead of despair. The spark in his eyes grew steadier, his voice stronger. Where once he walked with hesitation, he now carried himself like a man relearning his own worth. Daniel noticed in the smallest ways. The way Michael began to mentor a junior engineer, explaining patiently instead of rushing. The way he stayed late, not because he was told to, but because he wanted to. The way, little by little, the whispers in the office turned from doubt to quiet admiration. Still, the road wasn't smooth. There were setbacks. Moments when Michael froze in the middle of a meeting, haunted by flashes of his past. Times when James challenged him, pressing, doubting, waiting for him to crumble. But each time Michael stood taller. Not perfect, not flawless, but resilient. Because Daniel had given him a chance, and Michael had chosen to fight for it. What neither of them knew then was how far the second chance would take them both. For Michael, it wasn't just about a job. It was about reclaiming dignity, about proving, not just to the world, but to himself, that he was still the man he once believed he could be. And for Daniel, watching this quiet transformation unfold, it was the beginning of a lesson he himself would never forget. Michael Carter's life had once been reduced to a park bench, a paper cup, and the sound of footsteps passing him by. But now, for the first time in years, he woke up with an alarm clock instead of the rising sun. He brewed coffee in a chipped mug instead of begging for spare change on the corner. And though his apartment was small, bare, and modest, it was his. A door he could lock, a bed he could call his own. Rebuilding a life is never loud. It doesn't happen in one triumphant moment of applause. It happens in silence, over slow mornings, long nights, and choices made in the shadows no one else sees. For Michael, every day was a test of discipline, a test of resilience, a test of whether he could truly rise from the ashes of what he had lost. At work, his presence no longer drew the stares it once had. The whispers had softened, and in their place, something new began to grow: curiosity, even respect. Colleagues who once looked through him now sought his advice on problems that left them stuck. His handwriting appeared on whiteboards across the office, sketches, diagrams, solutions. The same marker that had once shaken in his hand now moved with quiet confidence. But the transformation wasn't just professional. After years of silence, Michael began to speak again. At lunch breaks, he joined conversations instead of eating alone. He shared pieces of his story. Not the pain in its entirety, but fragments, enough for people to see that behind the weary eyes was a man who had known both brilliance and suffering. Slowly, walls came down. Slowly, he belonged. Outside the office, Michael's world stitched itself back together in pieces. He learned to walk through the city without feeling invisible. He stopped avoiding the bookstore where he once lingered, and instead, he bought a second-hand novel, underlining passages that spoke to him. He found himself sitting in a park not to sleep, but simply to breathe, to watch children play, to remind himself that joy still existed in the world. Yet, rebuilding wasn't without struggle. There were nights when grief clawed its way back into his chest. Nights when he reached for the bottle he had sworn off, hands trembling, before pulling back, clenching his fists, and whispering his wife's name into the darkness. He had lost her. He could never bring her back. But what he could do was honor her by living, by becoming again the man she once believed in. Daniel Hayes watched all this unfold with a quiet pride he rarely allowed himself to show. He wasn't one for grand speeches, but he noticed the details. The way Michael no longer slouched when he walked, the way his eyes held steady contact, the way his voice carried just a bit more weight in every meeting. Daniel knew what many men in his position never understood. Money could build towers, but couldn't rebuild a soul. That had to be done one day, one choice, one fragile step at a time. And slowly, Michael wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. One evening, after a particularly long day, he stayed behind the office long after the others had gone home. He sat at the whiteboard, sketching designs, lost in thought. When Daniel passed by, he stopped in the doorway, watching. Michael didn't notice at first. His brow was furrowed, his hand steady, his focus absolute. It was a portrait of a man who had found his way back. Not all the way, not completely, but enough to prove that redemption was real. For the first time in years, Michael Carter felt like he was no longer defined by what he'd lost, but by what he was building again. And that rebuilding, fragile, imperfect, but undeniable, was only the beginning of the life he had yet to reclaim. In the end, what Daniel Hayes discovered wasn't just about one man's redemption. It was something bigger, something deeper. He had offered Michael Carter a single chance, not knowing if it would lead to failure or ridicule. Yet what unfolded proved a truth often forgotten in boardrooms and busy streets. A person's worth is never measured by the state you find them in, but by the fire that still burns beneath the ashes. Daniel saw firsthand how easy it is to dismiss people by their appearance, by the chapter of life they're stuck in, the torn coat, the unshaven face, the outstretched hand on a cold sidewalk. Society trains us to glance, to pity, to pass by without truly looking. But Michael's story forced Daniel to ask himself, how many others have been ignored, not because they lacked brilliance, but because they no longer looked like brilliance. Michael's revival became more than just a success story inside the company. It became a mirror, a reminder to Daniel and everyone who watched it unfold that leadership is not only about profits or strategies or the next quarterly report. True leadership is about vision, not just a vision to see where a business can go, but the vision to see what a broken soul can become when someone believes in them again. And Michael, once invisible on the pavement, was now a living testament to that belief. His designs began shaping the company's future, his ideas sparking innovation. But perhaps more powerful than his skills was a quiet inspiration he brought. Younger employees looked at him and realized, mistakes don't have to be permanent. Setbacks don't have to define the rest of your life. Redemption is not only possible, it is powerful. Daniel learned something about himself, too. He realized that giving money is easy. Dropping a coin in a cup takes seconds, costs nothing to heart. But giving someone dignity, giving them a place to stand, a role to play, a chance to matter again, that is rare. That takes courage. That takes faith. And maybe that's why this story resonates beyond one man, one CEO, one company. Because beneath it all, it asks us the question, how many lives had changed if, instead of pity, we offered purpose? For Daniel Hayes, the answer was clear. That single moment on a city sidewalk wasn't just the start of Michael's second chance. It was the beginning of a philosophy that would ripple far beyond his office doors. A philosophy rooted in compassion, in dignity, in the belief that sometimes the greatest investment isn't in stocks or products or markets, but in people who've been forgotten. And for Michael Carter, the bigger lesson was this. Even when life has stripped everything away, even when the world has turned its back, all it takes is one person, one chance, to prove that your story isn't over. Because redemption doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives quietly in second chances, in doors reopened, in hope restored. And sometimes that is enough to rebuild an entire life. So what do we take away from all of this? A CEO walking past a beggar could have been just another fleeting moment on a busy street. A quick coin dropped in a cup, a head turned the other way, forgotten in seconds. But Daniel Hayes chose differently. He chose to see. And because of that choice, a man rediscovered not only his purpose, but his dignity. Michael Carter's story isn't just about engineering brilliance or a second chance at a career. It's about how fragile life can be, how quickly success can unravel, and how deeply human it is to fall, to stumble, to break. But more importantly, it's about how powerful it can be when someone reaches out, not with pity, but with faith. Maybe as you've been listening, you've thought of someone in your own life, someone who once had so much potential, but whose light seems dimmed. Maybe a friend, a family member, or maybe even yourself. If so, let this story remind you, no chapter is final, no failure is permanent, and no one is ever too far gone for a second chance. Because sometimes the greatest transformations don't come from handouts, but from being trusted to stand again. And that's why we tell these stories here. Stories that remind us of compassion, of courage, of the hidden strength inside ordinary people. Stories that show us that one small choice, one act of belief, can change everything. If this story touched you, if it stirred something in your heart, I want to invite you to stay connected with us. Here on Heartfelt Tales TV, we share stories just like this. Stories of hope, redemption, and the quiet power of kindness. So, if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story that just might change the way you see the world. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because in the end, what we give others, what we believe in them, has the power to echo far beyond what we'll ever know. This was Heartfelt Tales TV. Thank you for listening. Thank you for feeling. And thank you for being part of a community that still believes in the beauty of second chances. And remember, sometimes the smallest gesture, the quietest act of faith, can rebuild a life. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep believing in the stories that matter.